And we are live finally here on Liquid Lunch. It is September 10th, 2014. It's me, Hugh, and Rose is joining us for a very special interview we have now with Dr. Robert Gilbert, who is in town from, drove in from Montreal. But usually you're down in the U.S. or elsewhere talking about frequency and stuff. And Rose, why don't you just give everybody a little introduction to Robert before we get into it with him.
Thanks, Hugh. And thanks, everyone, for your patience. We're a little bit late today, but we're so delighted to have Dr. Robert J. Gilbert with us. It's been a long time coming. We've been looking forward to welcoming you in the Liquid Lunch studio for some time now. Dr. Gilbert is the founder of the Vesica Institute, based in Asheville, North Carolina. And Robert, could you please tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and the mandate of the Vesica Institute, and maybe even why you're in Toronto today?
Thank you very much. Yes, my original background was actually as a nuclear, biological, and chemical warfare defense and survival specialist in the U.S. Marine Corps. And at that time, I studied a variety of scientific fields. After that, I went and got my PhD in international studies. And in international studies, I was able to then study many different world cultures. And I particularly became interested in studying the esoteric and spiritual teachings, and really the spiritual science of these different cultures, and how they fit together in a coherent way that we don't always think about in our modern culture. We think of these as separate traditions, but really they're working with a universal science of human development, of consciousness and energy, and human spiritual evolution. And so that then led to the development of the Vesica Institute around the year 2000, based in Asheville, North Carolina. And from that time, we've been having a project to bring together information from many different traditions under the name of spiritual science to create a really clear, coherent body of information for people that are interested in the metaphysical, people that want to understand the larger spiritual context of modern life, and to understand an effective path of personal and spiritual development. And so our paradigm for that is that just as in modern science and the physical sciences, where they build up information over time to be a coherent body of knowledge. And every year when new discoveries are made, they add that to the existing body of knowledge in biology, chemistry, physics, etc. And so you've got this cumulative knowledge that keeps being added to and keeps developing, and it becomes shared amongst everyone involved in that field, whether it's physics, biology, chemistry. We need the same thing in modern metaphysics, because metaphysics is really every aspect of life beyond the physical. And so everything has to do with the meaning of human life, and the thing that makes life worthwhile to us is contained within the metaphysical. And so everything to do with our thinking, our emotions, our actions in the world, whether or not our lives become something that is greatly beneficial to ourselves and others, or something where we're just caught in an endless trap of suffering, is really linked to this metaphysical level. And so to bring together this information from multiple traditions to be something coherent, rather than split amongst all these different closed groups, and with the classical systems where a lot of information was kept secret, we're really living in a time that information is moving to where it can be gathered together and concisely taught to anyone in a way that's really never been possible in earlier historical periods.
I'm so glad you mentioned physics, chemistry, and biology, because I was going to ask you about a comparison between the two. Being someone of with a background in the, can we call those the hard sciences, or what do we call it? The hard sciences. There are certain methodologies that are in place. For example, in formulating hypotheses, testing it, and drawing conclusions. What are the similarities and differences between that and the metaphysical sciences? Was it a big leap for you to make? Can you apply any of the methodologies that you used before in your career as a hard scientist?
I think there's a strong foundation in any type of science that has to do with observation and replication of results. And so in the hard sciences, they restrict it to only the physical level. And so if you want to understand what is a squirrel in the hard sciences, you'll kill the squirrel, cut it into its separate parts, lay it out on a metal plate, and say that's a squirrel. But that's just something dead. And it's just a bunch of dissociated parts that don't actually make up the entity that is a squirrel per se. So there's the aspect there that it's what we refer to as being reductionist and very instrumental. It's not really concerned with holism, how things work as a whole, complete system. And so for both bodies of work, though, there is the observing of how things work and being able to replicate certain types of results. And so that's common between them. But the differences have to do with the extremely reductionist, only physical level approach that you have in the hard sciences versus the inclusion of every aspect of human and spiritual life that you have in the metaphysical and holistic world.
Can we talk a little bit about how, what kind of a result or a conclusion might be drawn in a metaphysical study and how that could be replicated?
Well, I think the essence of it is actually looking at what is the foundation of the internal life of a human being, and to look at what is the actual context that we live in. So I have a somewhat simplified 5-level model of how this fits together, where most people start out in life basically having a type of programming of their external environment, of the way things are. And that's our culture, our family, the religion we're brought up in. And it gives us a particular paradigm that we operate under. And we tend to operate in a fairly unconscious way under that paradigm until we go through a state of internal awakening where we realize that we're not really fully conscious, we're not making fully conscious decisions, we're not really aware of what's playing out through us in our thought, our speech, and our action. And so then we get to the place that we begin to be aware that we can actually wake ourselves up to a higher level. We can be more conscious, and we can stop creating the destructive effects that we have in our relationships and other parts of our life by finding a way that we can get beyond what's often referred to as the reactive mind, the part of us that's just purely in reaction to things externally and is not fully conscious. So that initial observation is something that you find in all the classical spiritual traditions, where you find that in Buddhism they talk about developing mindfulness. So you start being able to observe yourself in an objective way, not making excuses for what you're doing, but see it objectively. And in things like the work of the Russian philosopher Gurdjieff, where he talks about the practice of waking up, because we're normally semi-conscious. We can wake up and we can begin to remember ourselves and to go through a daily process where we are much more conscious and making conscious choices and decisions. So with that being really the first stage of a multiple stage process that every person goes through in a process of awakening, that's things that used to always be within temple initiation within certain spiritual systems in the past, and today it's become common parlance, but only in the last 100 years. And this is the foundation of modern psychology. And so starting about 100 years ago and really picking up steam about 50 years ago, we now have the entire field of self-help psychology, where people begin to note their reactive mind, their destructive forms of patterns that they can actually consciously change, with things like being passive-aggressive to other people, with projecting our own things that we have difficulty with onto other people and blaming them for them. These kinds of fundamental first steps used to be restricted to spiritual schools. Now it's common parlance and everybody works with it, but that's a very recent development.
So is the information that we see in the marketplace today mainly gleaned from people who have studied these ancient traditions?
In many cases, it is based on understanding of classical traditions, but in some cases it simply is that when you begin to wake up, these things become self-evident. You'll simply begin to observe the patterns. So the first stage for most people is beginning to be aware that they can simply observe their internal states, observe what's the contents of your thoughts, the contents of your emotions, the contents of your actions, and we can begin to see destructive patterns that have been integrated into all of these activities that we weren't even conscious of before. And then using basic self-help concepts, we start stopping those destructive activities and we replace them with things much more beneficial. We see the way that we've sabotaged our previous relationships with people through a what the Buddhists would call unskillful action, unskillful use of our thought and our speech and our actions with other people. And we get that onto a much more stable field. And then we begin to go to that second level of actually creating a new way of thinking, of speaking, of interacting with people. And so in taking that a bit further, what we then find is that as people clear the mind, they still the mind, they're able to then get past what's referred to in the East as the monkey mind chatter. And at that point that the mind is still, they enter into a third phase, which is what you see today in modern metaphysics, where you become aware of very subtle phenomena. So you become aware of things having to do with energies and consciousness, everything from the energetic auras that are around living beings to the concepts today that we have in energy medicine and things of that kind. So all of these things have their basis. These were all taught in the classical spiritual schools, but it's also as a person just begins to observe themselves inwardly and become quiet, they will come to these same understandings the classical schools had. It's just that through the classical schools we have thousands of years of collected observations and knowledge that can be brought together and make an effective modern spiritual science.
So the fact that more and more people are awakening in general and more of this information is available on the marketplace and there's whole new fields opening up, as you mentioned, self-help and psychology, is that because of the general literacy rate increasing in the world, we're more educated, or is there something larger at play? The fact that everything is coming out now.
I think there is a larger science of patterns that's involved here, where you'll find that every major classical tradition has a particular study of time cycles, and these time cycles have particular influences on human beings individually and also collectively. So, for example, at a microcosmic level, you would have with Chinese medicine an understanding of the meridian clock, where certain meridians in the body are activated at different times. That has effects on our consciousness and our health. And then at a greater level, you then find in different traditions the study of particular time cycles, some of which are extremely large, last thousands of years or hundreds of thousands of years, that then lead to particular stages in an evolutionary process, really an alchemical process of development. But we think of it today as evolution.
Would that be something like astrology?
Astrology would be one part of this, where the astrology would give us a view of the time cycle based on the cosmic clock of where the planets and the stars are aligned, and that'd be a way to keep time through an observation of cosmic phenomena. And that could also have an effect on the time cycle. Certain types of alignments or phases would have an energetic effect. But every major tradition studies this. And so connected with what's happening right now, I would actually see that what's happened with the rise of literacy rates as part of a larger metaphysical process of a kind of awakening. And this is understood in particular traditions.
So it's vice versa in a way. It's not the awakening that has come as a result of higher literacy rates, but the opposite.
That's right. The literacy increase has actually come as an increase in consciousness, as a change in consciousness as a general phenomenon. And you'll find this, for example, if you look at the system of Kriya Yoga coming from India, that this is founded by Babaji, a great initiate, and then through Sri Yuktasvar, handed down through other teachers. And in their teachings, they talk about the end of Kali Yuga, the end of the spiritual dark age, happened around 1699 and was completed in 1899. And so from that paradigm, something has shifted, something has changed in human consciousness. And if we then look at reflections of that in human culture, these things would have no power and no validity if you couldn't actually see that it's actually manifesting in the world around us. So it was only about 100 years ago that you had the beginning of what we think of today as the modern free metaphysical movement, with the beginning of the Theosophical Society. Before that time, if you wanted to do spiritual work, you would join one particular tradition, and often you'd be connected to just that one tradition for your entire lifetime. Now we have millions of people on a free spiritual search to put together pieces from every tradition and from every corner of the planet, with a release of information from so many traditions that have never released their information before.
The fact that every person has the ability to freely search is possibly at once a blessing and makes things more difficult?
Yes, at the Vesic Institute, we sometimes refer to this as both a blessing and a curse.
Yeah.
The blessing is that we have unbelievable information available now from all kinds of traditions all over the planet that in previous times you had had to have spent years of intensive study connected to only that one tradition to get small fragments of that information. Now you can go to a bookstore and buy a collected summary of that knowledge for $12.95 in many cases.
Or get it free on the internet.
So we have the situation where there's a lot of information available out there, but particularly with the internet part of it, a lot of the information is actually not of very high quality, and a lot of it is actually quite erroneous when they talk about classical spiritual knowledge. And so we have a huge amount of information out there, but what is the quality of the information? What is the actual use and validity of that information? And so we are in a situation today where we have a flood of information, but most people in modern metaphysics have never had a real education in the foundations of a spiritual science. And so they don't know the most essential things that people would have learned in any classical tradition when they went through a type of initiatory process. So the thing today is to sort through this massive information, put it together into a useful format. Just like in modern science, again, they accumulate information in any particular field. And then everyone can be trained in that accumulated knowledge. And then that moves into a series of effective practices.
So this is the mandate of the Vesic Institute.
It's basically to be involved with that process of collecting and making as concise as possible the effective pieces of information from multiple traditions. And through that overview, we can also then see hidden connections between the teachings and practices of multiple traditions all over the planet that simply are not visible until you learn about the multiple traditions and how they overlap.
So your findings then show that there are more commonalities than differences between the various traditions,
Absolutely.
spiritual traditions.
Is there an emerging unified approach then, based on your work and seeing what's in common among these different traditions?
I believe so, and I think we're seeing that as a natural outgrowth in metaphysics today. Again, with so many millions of people on independent spiritual paths of inquiry, they're finding these key pieces from multiple traditions and putting them together into their own synthesis. That's happening on a mass basis now. It's going to take, of course, a period of time for this to shake out to become something really coherent. But I believe that the more that you understand the foundations of the different systems, the more you do see certain core things at the foundation of the work. So as I was mentioning a moment ago, you find the beginning is that on a particular evolutionary pathway, people begin to become more conscious, more self-aware, realize that they're playing out various type of programmed and sometimes destructive internal concepts, that they can become more self-aware, they can observe themselves, they can begin to transform this in a beneficial way and begin to move their thought, speech, and action up to a higher level. So in practices like Buddhism, like in Japanese esoteric Buddhism, this is a very direct practice, so that you take on the thought of a particular Buddha figure, the speech of a Buddha figure, the actions of a Buddha figure. It's not so much praying to one, a Buddha figure, but rather resonating with it and taking on its qualities. And so this is really common across all traditions. They might use different names for the spiritual figures that we're trying to emulate, but they all have the same concept of become self-aware, observe your internal reactions, change that to something more beneficial, and then you'll start becoming aware of very subtle aspects of your own consciousness and energy and that of other people. And that's what's led us today to energy medicine. So energy medicine is something that has paths coming from India and China and South America and traditions all over the world. They're all leading to this new growth of energy medicine.
Plus new technologies that are being invented, right?
Absolutely, coming all the time through the synthesis of these traditional bodies of knowledge. And once people become sensitive to subtle energies and get into energy medicine, things of this kind, then at the next level they then become aware there's an entire invisible world around us. Every spiritual tradition on the planet talks about the physical world as like the tip of an iceberg, that the real reality around us is a vast invisible world with all these different levels or layers to it. So for example, in our online course, Essential Teachings and Practices of Spiritual Science, we start people out at the very beginning of the online course, teaching them the overview of the different levels of the human being and of the world around us from the perspective of multiple spiritual traditions. And then you can see how every major tradition is approaching this from the perspective of understanding all of these invisible levels. Because once you get past that third level of becoming aware of these subtle energies around us and into energy medicine, you then become aware that there's a whole vast world behind it that isn't just energetic, it's also a world of conscious beings that may not have physical form. And this is often treated in a very superficial or sensationalistic way in modern culture because it's so far outside of our physical materialistic paradigm. But something that every spiritual tradition teaches. The world is full of invisible beings and energies that are affecting us all the time. We just don't know it. And so these invisible energetics, as well as the beings, are affecting every thought that we have, every feeling that takes place inside of us, every action that we take. And so that's why every classical system teaches this to its initiates, what this particular framework of this invisible world is, and then begins to teach people effective practices where they can start discerning between these things in the invisible world and interacting with it directly in a way that's very beneficial. Mm-hmm. It can be
Could you give us an example of some of these spiritual beings, Robert?
So,
leprechauns? Garden gnomes?
Well, in fact, I mean, that's interesting, an interesting point, because there's different spiritual beings, there's different dimensionals. How do we, maybe you can just shed some light on this.
So again, you'll find every major tradition has a model for differentiating the different levels of the invisible world as well as the physical world. And so it might be done slightly differently in India than it is in China than it is in Greece, but they all have a particular framework for this. And so one of the common models you have in Western metaphysics today is we have a physical body. That's all that modern Western science looks at. But then it has to be animated by something. It's animated by the life body, which is called the chi, ki, or prana in the East, and called ether by the Greeks. There's also names for it in ancient Hebrew, and every major tradition knows about this vital life energy. Then the next level is getting into consciousness, which is often referred to as the astral body in the human being, or the astral plane outside of us. We're moving into the level of emotional awareness, and then mental awareness, and then higher levels of spiritual awareness, which have their own gradations to them. And so within all these different levels, there are different beings. All we perceive with the physical eyes in the physical plane are beings that have taken on a physical body. But what happens when we die? Do we just disintegrate? The materialistic view is that we don't exist without a physical body. But there's certainly much evidence, and many people directly experience that that's not the case, that there is survival after death. One of the great teachings from the Indian tradition is that one of the great mysteries of life is that everyone knows that everyone dies, but we all act as if we're never going to die. And so we spend our life chasing all types of superficial things that will not end up meaning anything, and also basically just chasing things in our desire nature. Whatever appeals to us at that moment, I want that. But for people that manage to satisfy their complete desire nature, they're wealthy, they got everything they ever wanted, they often end up in depression. Because I've got everything I could ever physically consume, but I can only eat so much food, I can only have so much physical sex, I can only have so much physical comfort, I can only own so many homes and actually be in them. What then am I going to have? And then you always end up with there's something beyond this superficial level. There's something that has to do with why are we here in the first place? What's the larger context for our lives? How can we use this time to our advantage? And that then becomes what's taught in the classical traditions as forms of spiritual initiation. How we start to change our internal structure with our thinking, our feeling, and our actions in the world. And how we then begin to develop subtle perception of all these invisible worlds outside of us.
What is your answer to that question? Why are we here in the first place?
I actually believe that we're here, and I believe this is supported by virtually every major tradition. We're here as a type of spiritual education process. We're in this type of brightly colored, hard, manifest physical world as a type of young spiritual being that's going through an educational process. And in this world, the consequences of wrong action